Now, the great thing about Ansible is the clients themselves don't need to have any specific software installed, but they do have to have some things working. For example, we want to know their static addressing. Now, this could just be static DNS names, like have DHCP assign host names, but we're going to do static addressing. It's the easiest and most reliable way to make sure that we're connecting to the right computers. Also, we have to set up SSH key pairs so that we can connect to them without the need for logging in manually, because that kind of takes away from the whole idea of automation. And then each computer is going to have to sudo to have access to, configure root file system stuff, right? So they all have to be able to escalate their privilege. And these are things that, while they don't require any Ansible software to accomplish, they're just configurations that have to be done on the computers. Now, our topology or our lab looks like this. The workstation is the computer that we log into. Now, that one gets its address via DHCP, and it's not going to be static because it doesn't matter. Remember, this could be a laptop that you bring in every day to work or something. So the address for this one doesn't matter because everything is going to be initiating from this. Nothing's going to have to connect directly to it. Now, the username is Nugget1. This computer is where the private key is installed. And then the other three computers are those that are on our lab environment. Now, the repo server is one that we don't normally connect to unless we're installing packages. This is where the repositories for our Linux operating systems over here live. However, this is a computer on the network. It has a static IP of 172.20.0.1, and this is an interesting thing. Its username is administrator. You might remember we talked in a previous nugget that it's ideal to have all the usernames the same. However, that's not a requirement. We're going to show you how we can connect to this client even though it has a different username. There is no Nugget1 user on the repo server. Now, we have an Ubuntu computer with this static IP address and a CentOS computer with this static IP address. They both do have the Nugget1 user, and we're going to configure them so that from this workstation we can log in to each of the individual three computers that we're going to be controlling without needing to log in using a username and password. We want it to be automated. And also, these have to be able to use sudo to escalate privilege. So let's go set that up, because our computers are already booted in our lab environment, but they're not set up for this kind of a situation. So the first thing we're going to do is create names to match these IP addresses, because I'm never going to remember these IP addresses throughout our entire course. Okay, so we're on the network, and we can actually ping those computers. So 172.20.0.5, and that'll return a response. However, what I want to do is be able to connect to them via name. So we're going to say sudo vi etc hosts. We're just editing our hosts file here. Gonna type your password, right? There we go. And we're going to add entries for those individual computers on our network. 172.20.0.1, you might remember we called repo. 172.20.0.5. See, I already don't remember which it was, so let's look back. Let's see, .5 is the CentOS machine, and that means 172.20.0.6 is Ubuntu. All right, so all we've done is edited a local host file, so we can ping these by name. So let's see, ping CentOS, sure enough. Ping Ubuntu, sure enough, and ping repo. All right, so those are all working. Now I'm going to clear the screen. We need to generate our SSH key. Now, we've covered this in other courses, so I'm going to go kind of fast. However, I want you to follow along and do it yourself so that you can see what's actually happening. So the first thing we do, we are Nugget1. That's the user that we're going to connect with. So SSH-keygen, and press enter. Now it says, where do I want to do this? We can accept the defaults. I want to save the private key and public key pair inside my .ssh folder. So I'm just going to say enter. Created the directory, enter passphrase. Now I'm going to put no passphrase. All right, this is where if you wanted to be more secure and you wanted to use something like SSH agent to store this passphrase, you could. For our environment here, I really want to concentrate on Ansible. So what I want to do is make this empty so we don't need to worry about authentication to connect to the computer. So I'm going to say an empty passphrase. Same empty passphrase again. All right, so now if we look in .ssh, we have two things. We have our public key, which is IDRSA pub, and our private key, IDRSA. Now remember, never send the private key anywhere. It's only going to stay on this computer. However, we do want to copy the public key to our other three computers. So we use a program called SSH copy ID. Get my mouse out of the way there. SSH copy ID -I, and the identity file that we're going to use is .ssh ID _ RSA. Which one? I'm going to use the .pub one because I'm never going to send my private key anywhere. The public key is the identity that I want to send and copy to the other computer. All right, so to do this, we say SSH copy ID, the identity of the file that we want to send, and then where we want to send it. I want to send it to Ubuntu. Now, I could say nugget1 at Ubuntu, and it's the same thing because if you don't specify the user, it uses your same user that you currently are. Okay, so I'm going to say that. Well, that's an interesting error. We're unable to copy it because Ubuntu is not responding on port 22. That's because the Ubuntu client that we've installed over here does not install SSH server by default. Now, again, we don't have to have any Ansible software, but we do have to have the SSH server running. So that's an easy thing to fix. We'll say sudo apt-get install open SSH server, the password, yes. Okay, it's installed SSH. Now if we come back over here and we try the same thing again, so copy SSH to nugget1 at Ubuntu, now we should be able to connect. And it says, all right, you want to accept this key? Yes. Now I do have to type the password the first time because we're installing a key so we don't have to type the password anymore. However, to connect to it, to copy that key over, I still have to have the password. So $$ W0RD. And all right, so it added the key. So now if we say SSH Ubuntu, boom, here we are. We're in Ubuntu 16. We're no longer in the Ansible computer here. We're no longer in our workstation. We're telnetted over, or we're SSH'd over to Ubuntu 16. All right, so I'll press exit. And boom, now we're back in our Ansible workstation here. So we've done that. We've set it up. Now we're going to do the same thing for the other two computers. Now CentOS actually happens to have it installed. The SSH server is installed by default. So we're going to say SSH copy ID -I to CentOS. Yes. All right, so we're installed there. Let's try SSH CentOS. And there we are. We've SSH'd in there with no passwords. And one last one. Now we're going to have an issue because if I just do the same thing, it's going to say, no, that's not correct. Now what's the problem here? Well, if you remember, there is no nugget1 user on the repo server. So in order to do the SSH copy ID, what we actually have to do is go to a user that is there. So administrator at repo. Does that make sense? We're copying this public file to the repo server, but we have to connect as a user, and there's no nugget1 user, so we have to specify administrator. When I didn't put any user at all, it used the user that I currently am on this system, nugget1. But since that doesn't exist, it gave me an error. So now if we say administrator at repo, press enter, now it's going to ask for the password, and this one should work. Boom, it's done there. So now if we say SSH administrator at repo. Okay, so we have the SSH keys all installed. Now we just have to do one more thing. We have to make sure they can all sudo in order to attain system privilege, right? In order to escalate their privilege. And here's the kicker. We want them to be able to escalate their privilege without using a password. Because now if I type sudo ls, it's going to ask for my administrator password. Well, I don't want Ansible to have to type in the sudo administrator password in order to escalate privilege. So we're going to edit the sudoers file. And to do that, we type sudo, because we have to do it as root, visudo. So vi sudo. Press enter, and it's going to ask for my password because I'm running sudo. So p. And now this is the sudoers file. In here is where we're going to make the change that will allow us to escalate without using any password. So we're going to say for the user administrator, all equals all, no password, all. Now that's kind of a weird thing going on here. So administrator all equals all, no password all, which means I can do everything, escalate, and become any user and not require any password. Let's see if that worked. We'll save this. All right, and now if we type sudo ls, awesome. Let's escape, make sure that wasn't cached. So SSH administrator at repo, okay, no password, and now sudo ls /. And so now it actually showed us stuff. And notice it didn't ask me for a sudo password either. So now this computer is all ready to go. Let's do the same thing for the other two. SSH Ubuntu, sudo vi sudo. This time it's going to ask for a password, PASSWORD. All right, we're going to do the same thing down here. This time it's going to be nugget1 all equals all space no pass wd colon all. All right, and now we'll save this. Exit, let's SSH back in to make sure those sudo credentials weren't cached. And now sudo ls /. And boom, it didn't ask us for a password, so this one is all set. Now it's going to be a little bit different on CentOS, so let's go there quickly. Because with CentOS, you're not allowed to use sudo by default. So we're going to say su dash, and it's going to ask for the root user's password. Now, on this computer, that's actually set to the same thing. So it's going to be $$w0rd. And now we're root on CentOS. Now, sudo is installed, so if we type vi sudo, we're going to get that same screen. I mean, it's going to be a little bit different, but the same basic configuration screen. And we are going to add to the bottom of it for nugget1 all equals all in parentheses space no password colon space all. All right, so then we're going to save this. And now we're going to type exit. So now we're just the regular nugget1 user on CentOS. And now we should be able to say sudo ls /. And it just showed us, it didn't ask us for any password to escalate privilege. And we are able to do it as root, do an ls of the / directory. So exit. Now we are all set. Every one of our computers we're able to SSH in without using any password, and once we get there, allowed to execute sudo commands without needing to authenticate that as well. So all three of our workstations are set up for us to connect and do things without any authentication. Now you can probably see that's going to be a little bit scary, right? That's why you maybe want to have a specific user set up for running Ansible. Maybe you have an Ansible user that you have on each of your computers that you connect to. Maybe you do want to force it to use authentication, so you have to manually go through. But for pure automation, you're going to want to make sure that you don't have to do interactive authentication in order to run commands. And we're all set up for how we're going to do that. Let's look back at the slide to make sure we got it covered. We have all three of our computers are configured to SSH into, and they can all escalate privilege without passwords, so we are all set. We covered a lot of stuff this time. If you're unfamiliar with SSH key pairs, maybe look at some of the other courses, because we're going to cover that deeper in some basic Linux courses. I really want to focus on that, though. I really want to focus on Ansible. So we did those SSH keys pretty quickly. Sudo, you learned how to edit the privileges for escalation in the vi sudo command. And then, of course, we made sure that our static addressing is there so we can reach those computers without remembering those long IP addresses that I forgot halfway through this nugget when we were doing it in the first place. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.